Hey guys, welcome back to another video on sequelize ORM using Node.js. And I know I said I wasn't going to do this in just the last video, but I thought I would because it's a really easy thing. So in the last video, we covered all of this stuff. So we've gone through validation, we've checked to see if that user already exists. If so, we're returning an error. We're then moving on to create a new user. And creating a new user is actually composed of checking to make sure arguments were passed. And now we want to check the permission ID that was passed. So looking in this user DB function, we see here that we're having this argument passed to us, but we don't really want to say if arguments.permission ID doesn't exist, set args to permission or set args.permission ID to equal 2, because if we pass in an args.permission ID of 10, this won't run, and we would be giving this person an argument or a permission ID that doesn't exist in our database. So we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do real quick is we're going to create a function, a private function, because this should really only be used by this file. But let's create a private function that says, give me all of the user IDs, or not user IDs, permission IDs available. Now, obviously, this is JavaScript. There is no such thing as public-private functions, but it's a pretty common syntax to if you have a function that's going to be private, you just put an underscore in front of it. So we'll say async function and then underscore get permission IDs. And actually, let's not say get permission IDs. Let's call it validate permission IDs. For validate permission ID. Okay, and it's going to take in a permission ID. Okay, now what we need to do, we need to reach into that permissions table and grab all of its different, grab all of its different values. So I'm not going to write a test for that because we actually have a very sequelize, it's just going to be one sequelize line, and I expect that sequelize works. So what we're going to say is const permissions equal, and then remember how we get permission or get things from the database. Now in this function up here, username exists. We said db.user.find1. Here's the thing though, we don't want to find one. We want to find all of them, right? Well, actually no, we do just want to find one. We have a permission ID. So now let's say db.permission, right? If we look in our models and we look at our permission model, we see that we're exporting this with the name permission. Okay, so let's close this. So in here, we're going to say db.permission.find1, and then remember up here, we'll pass an object, but up here we said where, and then username. Well, here we're going to say where, and we can't use destructuring this time, so we'll say ID is equal to permission ID. Okay, so by passing it this object, we're basically, this is going to translate. So let's write a quick comment here. So this would translate to something like select, I can't type, select star from permission where ID equals whatever permission ID we have, we're passing in. So let's say we passed in the permission ID 1. So it would look like that's what it's going to write out. So select star from permission ID where ID equals 1 and limit 1. So that's what this is going to actually generate. Okay? So let's get rid of that. Now, if this finds something, it's going to pass us back an object. If it doesn't find anything, it's going to pass us back null. So we're going to say if permissions, so that means it was found, we want to return permissions. And that's going to return that object instance. Otherwise, return null. Okay, so there we're good. The only thing we have to do is add a wait here because this is an async function. So basically, again, what we're doing here is we're passing in a permission ID, and then we're querying the database to say, does this permission actually exist? If it does, return the object instance of that permission. If it doesn't, return null. Very simple. So up here in create user, we don't want to do this anymore because we know that this is wrong, but I'm going to leave it there for just a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to check, so let's say const permission equals await validate permission ID. And we're passing in a permission ID. So then we're going to say args dot permission ID. So actually we can leave this piece of code here because if it doesn't exist, we need to set it to something, right? But if it does exist, then this is going to not run, and we're just going to pass in whatever it is here. So this is good. We'll actually leave this be here. Next, we're going to say, actually, no, we're good. All right, so, oh, no, actually. So if permission is not a thing, meaning that it was unable to find this specific permission, we're going to throw a new error invalid argument permission ID not found. Okay. So now we're going to throw an invalid argument saying, hey, you did give us a permission ID, but we didn't find this permission ID. So now let's write our test. I know we should have written the test before, but we're writing it afterwards, and I'm okay with that this time. It should throw an error because an invalid permission ID is passed to create user. Okay, so let's go up here again. We'll write our little comment and say, so we already know what it's going to do. It should throw an error, but what's it going to return? So it's going to return an error, and that error message should be, so if we grab this from here, this is what the error message should be. Okay. And so we'll write try catch E, expect E dot message, or well, let's say expect E to be an error. And expect E dot message to equal invalid argument permission ID not found. All right, so what do we want to do? Well, let's go ahead and grab all of this. And paste it right in that try block. And then let's say that we pass a permission ID, so const permission ID equals, and let's just put in some gobbledygook, something that we know won't actually exist. And let's see what actually happens. I'm going to create a stop point, a break point, right here in this, because I want you to see what this permissions object will look like, both in the instance that it does run and it doesn't run. So this is going to be the instance that it doesn't actually succeed. So if we run this, oh, I actually just hit run. So this is going to pass, or at least it should pass. Okay, good. This did pass. Yes, this did pass, and it wouldn't have created a user because we did provide a permission ID. It was just an invalid permission ID. Now, there is some argument probably to be made that if the invalid or permission ID was passed, you could just set their permission ID to 2. I'm not going to do that because I don't want someone to be able to pass an invalid permission ID and then reset it for them, because that might be something that like needs to be a certain permission ID. Maybe we're creating an admin and we're about to give them access to other admin things, so we don't want them to accidentally be set to 2. Okay, so that actually passes. Now let's debug this and see why it passed. So here we see that permissions, oh, oopsies. I bet I didn't add that back. I didn't. Okay, so if we look at our users database, I bet there's a couple users in there now. There's 1. All right, let's let this pass. And make sure that we actually pass in permission ID here. Now it'll still pass if I run it like this, but it'll pass for the correct reasons. Okay. So now if we debug, okay, so we see that permissions was equal to null, and that's because we passed in a permission ID of sflkjflkdsj. That obviously doesn't exist. So we're good here. Permissions is going to be equal to null. So now if I let this run a little bit longer, we're saying if permissions is not true, throw this new error, and since permissions is null, we can throw a new error and everything will rerun, everything will run perfectly. Now, if I, no, what was I going to say? If I do actually insert the correct user ID, I want this to keep going. So in our user DB test, if I insert the right permission ID, not user ID, we're going to copy pretty much all of this test here, should create a user, and assign them permissions ID by default. So let's copy all of this. And before I forget, let's also go back into here and delete both of these users because they were created by mistake. Okay. So we'll create a new test down here, and we'll call this test. So it should create a new user with a valid user or valid permission ID by lookup in the permission table. Okay. So paste everything that I copied in there. And I'm actually going to change this though. Let's make the user or the permission ID equal to 1. So const permission ID equals 1. And then right here at the end, we will add permission ID. And I want to debug this real quick with you guys because we'll see now what this user DB is actually going to pass us back here on permission. Okay, so first we see that the permission ID being passed in is 1, and we see that permissions is actually an object, and it has data values, and those data values are created at, deleted at, ID, type. Why are there 2 deleted ats? Permissions, deleted, updated at. That is weird, because permissions doesn't have to. Okay, not sure why there's 2 deleted ats, but never mind that. All right, so we have data values deleted at, and then we have an ID and a type. It must create 2. That's very interesting. Okay. So what's more important though is that this permission does exist. It's going to return this permission object. So when we go up here to this next step, if we let it step in here, this isn't going to run. So next it's going to go to here because it actually can run. And we have first name, last name, username, password, email, and finally permission ID equals 1. All right, so we can let that play out. It won't insert it because, at least it shouldn't insert it, or it should insert it and delete it right away. So now we can go back to user DB test, actually let it run just to make sure that it does what it's supposed to. And everything works. Every once in a while, I do like just running the entire suite, especially once I'm done creating a large functionality, making sure I didn't change something throughout everything I did that accidentally broke some tests. So we're all good to go. Now we have a functioning create user function here that's going to check to make sure all the arguments it was passed are valid. It's going to make sure that it was passed a foreign key for the permission ID that actually exists, and then finally it will create the user. In the next video we can finally, I know you've been waiting this for a long time, but in the next video we can finally add it to this user gateway and finish up this route for creating a new user. I'll see you there.
You said that you needed me like a car.